Matt Dossie. I'm here with Eric Grubaugh, and we're here to talk about workflows and scripts and discuss when one should use one versus the other. I'm personally of the opinion that workflows have their place. Eric has another opinion. So, Eric, why don't you get us start off with your feelings on this?
Sure. Jumping right into it. I do think workflows have their place. I think that place is just a lot smaller than the place for scripts. The space where especially for me personally, right? I've been a NetSuite developer now for 7 years. And I can count the number of workflows I have built voluntarily on one hand. So I think the space for workflows is just a lot more limited. I think there's definitely a case for them. There is a place for them. But by far and away, especially if I have my druthers on a project, I'm almost always going to default to using a script. When I'm advising clients, then we get into a lot more factors, like especially what kind of skill sets do you have on hand and what is your budget? Things like that. So, but when I'm building a project, I will avoid workflows at all costs.
Tell me why you avoid workflows at all costs. There had to be an experience that's traumatized you.
Oh, multiple. I mean, to be fair, I'm certainly, being a developer, I'm biased towards scripts, right? I am definitely biased towards writing code. Sure. I'm much more familiar with that, and it's much faster for me to get to market, as it were, with code than it is with dragging blocks around on a UI. I think I've had several, I would say, workflow horror stories, I suppose. I won't go through them all. Most recently, I had to build, I say had to because part of it was already built. So I had to build a transaction approval workflow for vendor bills and purchase orders in workflows. And there were some very complicated rules, right? Complex set of rules and especially exceptions for there were different approval layers, and every approver had like a backup, and there were email notifications to go out on certain events. And so it's a pretty complex setup. Then there were rules for three-way matching, which I believe NetSuite has like a bundle for, which they installed and then modified. So that added to the complexity. And it just ended up, getting to manage this workflow. We ended up with like a dozen states, and every state transitioned to every other state. And so managing all the conditions and transitions on all those different states, just because of all the different pathways and possibilities, is just very hard to document, very hard to maintain, extremely hard to migrate across different environments. And it took, I think the project was estimated to take a month by someone else, and it took us, I think, 6 months to get it up and running. So it was awful.
So you think that this transaction approval workflow would have been better architected as a set of scripts? Is that right? I mean,
I believe I could have architected it better as a set of scripts. Yes.
I believe you could have architected it better either way, but
sure.
Was there a lot of change management in there? Like, are they constantly changing the rules on you? Was that what caused?
Sure. I mean, I didn't want to get into the project management side of things. That certainly had all kinds of challenges. There was lots of scope creep. There was lots of, not even just scope creep, but changing of our minds as to what it needed to do. So there were plenty of challenges on that side, but that has nothing to do with, workflow versus script. But the idea was that, another partner had very briefly started the three-way match, and that was sort of mostly working. And so they wanted to continue the process with more workflow. In the hopes that their admins would, kind of take on the brunt of supporting it and updating it and things like that. So it was my job to kind of architect a flexible architecture underneath the workflow, which I did my best to do. And then even once we went live, my experience was that their admins would just call me to change something. And that's something I see pretty regularly, is that that's one of the arguments for workflows, which I'm sure maybe you'll talk about, is that, hey, you don't need a developer. You can get an admin in there, or someone just familiar with process and business workflows, and they'll be able to make changes. But in my experience, they don't. They just, by default, will go back to the creator and say, hey, we need you to make this change, even if it's as simple like, we'll just go change this field here. Well, you just need to change the condition on this transition. That's not what happens. They don't go in and do it themselves.
Okay.
In my experience.
That's a fair point.
That depends mostly on the person, though, right? Of course. But
of course, who you're dealing with, and people come and go. Of course, admins aren't installed forever. They move on. They find other jobs, and new admins come on board.
Right.
The transition, I feel, and the documentation is just. And I'm going to get into my own horror stories, which is the flip side of that. Also, a transaction approval process, of course, in a workflow.
Yes. Touche.
That was written entirely in scripts with multiple custom records, and nobody to this day knows how it works.
Yeah.
The developers who've worked on it have long since moved on. It's a horror story, and we're going to end up having to probably refactor it into a workflow, because the admins that are in place now are able to do something as simple as changing the email address of where the email goes to, and that's really what kind of changes you'd expect an admin to be able to do. Go in, find, here's an email action, change the email to this person now instead of that person. Change it to this role instead of that role. That kind of work through on a workflow, I find that it sort of documents itself as long as you keep it simple. Always that caveat: if you've got complex logic, three-way matching, different tiers of approval, and you've got 7 different states, it may be time to script this thing rather than workflow. If we're talking about, showing a pop-up when a person puts in the wrong value in this field according to that other field, that's definitely a workflow. And I think we can both agree there's a line there where it's, when it gets to this level of complexity, you're fine. This level, go to a script.
Yeah, absolutely. I've recently built just that. When this field is this value, set the custom form to this. And that is absolutely workflow that. Super simple. And then you're right. Complexity is the bar of where I would change, but those bars move, right? Depending on who's building the project, who it's for, that sort of thing. So there's not like one, okay, automatically this is always a workflow and this is always a script.
Oh, absolutely.
Those bars definitely move.
And even throughout the life cycle of the feature, I think we can agree. Like, we'll start off, it's really simple. Here's a workflow that does that. I'm done in 20 minutes. And then the requirements come down the pipe later after it's in use. So this user says this user says that. We need to update this. We can no longer do that. Now we need to base it on this value, which is in a related record 3 steps away. Suddenly you do need a script. And in that case, if you've written yourself into a corner and you've added too much complexity to your workflow, you may have to start over, or it may just be a workflow action script to it and take care of that extra logic.
Yeah, I find that happens a lot. Is once you get to that certain level, you can easily fall into that sunken cost fallacy of like, oh crap, I've spent so much time on this workflow and my client spent a bunch of money on it, so we need to keep it going. So I'm going to add 12 workflow action scripts. That's egregious. But at a certain point.
But the same thing happens to a script as well, doesn't it? I mean, you start off with a user event and suddenly, now I need a sweetlet and a map reduce to handle the background because we're handling a dozen transactions at a time or 100 lines. And you're going to have that technical debt, right? I've got this sunk cost in there, like you said, and I've got to somehow make it worthwhile.
For me, that you definitely run into, yes, you absolutely run into those exact same problems. Um, and you're going to have, no matter what, you're probably going to have the same custom records and the same custom fields and all that. So that kind of nets out. And so what you're kind of left with, for me at least, is kind of the documentation and organization of the project and the feature. And that's where I really feel like workflows suffer a lot. A very simple workflow, you're totally right, is pretty self-documenting. It's very simple. But at a certain level of complexity, trying to follow all the different transitions and the different states, and like, yeah, if they need to change an email address and you say, oh, find this send email action. Well, what if there's 5 of them, right? Which one do they change? And then when you go look at the list of workflows, so if let's say you have the transaction approval process, and that involves maybe one workflow, maybe it's multiple workflows, and on different record types, maybe you can't. The only way to organize workflows is by record type. That's like the only filter you have on the list of workflows. That's all you can see is show me all the workflows on the customer record. So trying to see what are all the workflows involved in the transaction approval feature in the NetSuite UI is really difficult. So trying to get the whole scope of what this project is doing is very difficult. That's a little easier in scripts, still not great, but you at least have like folders, or you can organize your project into folders and put all the files. So all the files that deal with transaction approval are all in one folder. Yeah, there might be a MapReduce and a SuiteLit and a utility module and all kinds of stuff, right? But at least you can kind of really do your own level of organization to help reduce that initial like cognitive load of getting the scope of what this thing is doing.
I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit there. I think it's a kind of a wash in the UI. Finding, granted, and the problem is like even worse than you might say in one respect, because you can only filter by record type, and record type is like transaction. It's not even item fulfillment.
True. Yeah, that's true.
Sales orders or
I
whatever.
forgot about that.
You've got all these transaction workflows, and if you've got a ton of workflows, you could be there all day looking for the right one, especially if you didn't document a description for it. But
if you didn't name them well, if you didn't give them good IDs, same thing with scripts too. Yeah,
however, you flip that around, and then it becomes, if you're going from the scripted record view, you're seeing workflows applied to this record if it's an item fulfillment. So you don't really have that noise that you see just in the list of workflows, but then the scripts are also pretty neatly laid out. This client script and that, that user event script are all applied to this. Now that all that falls apart, of course, once you open up like a MapReduce or a scheduled script, which affects this. So the workflow is applied to it, but the script isn't applied to it. So you don't see that script in your scripted records. You have no idea what MapReduce is causing this problem. You just see in your system notes that a MapReduce did this, and now you've got, where do you go? You go to your list of MapReduces, and you try to do some homework. At least if it's a workflow, you've got something. You can see the workflows, and you can see there's, that this workflow did that.
Yeah.
So doing your homework and trying to figure out what's happening, it's a little easier for me with a workflow. You've got a separate set of workflow logs on a record too, that you can really leverage it. You don't really get that. You get system notes, but all it tells you, a SuiteLit did this, a RESTlet did that.
Right.
A MapReduce or a scheduled script. Yeah, right. Which is frustrating. So there's that. Doing that homework is, I think, a little bit easier with the workflow. I think the development cycle is a little tighter as well. Once you're used to, you have to know you have to know workflows. First of all, you have to know, what entry points are triggered at what points and what actions are supported, and that sort of thing. All the little nuances that workflows have. But once you have that, I feel like your development cycle is a little smaller in a workflow. You can test and execute a little bit faster. One of the advantages, I don't think it's completely outweighed by some of the disadvantages that I'm sure you've got lined up here. I can think of a bunch of them. where
Mhm.
that make it difficult to work with a workflow. Let's talk about some of those, I guess.
Sure.
You've got some. You give us a horror story about a transaction approval process. I've got the flip side, obviously, where one was scripted and it's a mess.
Just fair.
And that could be. I think if you have a bad architecture, you're going to have bad architecture no matter which approach you take.
Yeah, certainly.
And if we're talking about change management, and if it's something like you have admins that are capable of changing an email address, and if your workflow is simple enough, I don't think anybody argues. Do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got hands-off admins or frankly incompetent admins, then definitely the script is the way to go. No one's gonna mess with your script, and if they do, you can roll it back from source control. Hard to do that with a workflow. Hopefully.
You're not source controlling your scripts, you're doing it wrong.
Agreed. But now with SDF, you can source control your workflows too.
Sort of. That's one thing I have seen. So I have actually, despite maybe how it sounds, I have been doing a lot of workflow work recently. Most of the workflows I've had to write in my career have been in the last year. And so now that SDF is here, I use SDF, the Suite Cloud Developer Framework, as part of my workflow for every project I build, right? That's how I source control everything. That's how I keep track of everything. That's how I migrate everything. Use it. It's great. Yep. But again, at a certain level of complexity, SDF, and this is more on SDF than it is on workflows, right? But SDF does not support all the elements of a workflow. They don't always migrate nicely, especially when you start getting into like workflow fields and state fields and things like that. I had a lot of problems migrating even some fairly straightforward workflows. Not a lot of states or actions, just had a lot of data that I was keeping track of in workflow fields, and the transitions I did have were fairly complex with their conditions, and those just did not migrate well for whatever reason. I don't know why that is. Again, that's more on SDF than it is on workflows, but it is still a shortfall.
Yeah, agreed. And with one thing I've run into recently too in migrating workflows is that it's not specifically SDF, but with the new two-factor authentication requirements, the developer roles that are used for SDF to migrate, to connect to NetSuite with token-based authentication, they don't come with any permissions at all beyond what a developer might need. And when you have a workflow and that workflow is applied to a transaction, you cannot migrate it unless your role has access to transactions.
I had forgotten about that, but I have run into that as well.
It's a mess. And so yeah, it used to be I could migrate a workflow pretty easily with SDF, and although mine probably weren't as complex as yours with keeping track of state fields and workflow fields and things like that.
Sure.
I was able to do it at least in some scenarios. Nowadays, it's become much more complex in the environment we're in now.
Right. Let's see, what else did I have in here? So SDF was one thing, but that's mostly on SDF, right? That'll catch up and that'll even out. Yeah. So we can't really fault workflows for that. But so one of the problems I definitely ran into we talked about organization already. One thing I find difficult with workflows is especially conditions, keeping track of conditions and like your logical path of things. When those conditions get complex, one, it's super hard to read, right? In those condition fields, it's just one line of text. If you have this long SQL-ish, condition, it's really hard to read unless you have to like dig into the UI of every single state and transition and et cetera to get any sense of what these are doing.
Yep.
And further, it's then when they're really complicated, if they're shared or similar between different transitions, you have to make sure you get it right in every single place, and that leads to a lot of potential copy pasta mistakes. You miss one transition and then suddenly this corner case of your workflow falls short and you don't find it because it's a corner case or something like that, right? So managing these complex pathways, especially when they are common or similar throughout the workflow, keeping that the same is very difficult. Whereas in, say, a script, I can put that in a module, in a function, and always call the function and know that I'm getting the same result every single time. So there's probably ways I could have architected those things better in my workflow. So I would love to hear your thoughts. But for me, I was copying and pasting these very similar complex condition into multiple, transitions, for instance.
Right. Whereas in a script, you would just have written one function and been calling that function
Yep.
throughout,
And we'd be good.
wherever it was needed to go. And a lot of that proceeds from the, your comfort zone. How do you think? If you think in a script manner, then you certainly should be more comfortable writing a script out of it.
Right.
It's difficult to bend your mind around the drag and drop UI, and the conditions are very limited. In a workflow, you cannot really give them much of a nuanced logical path. If this, then that is about as far as you go. If this and that, but not this, then that.
Yep.
That becomes very, very difficult. So,
and your ability to reach out to related records, if they're not, that one level join away, if you need to go further than that, you're just
that's
SOL.
a deal breaker right there. Immediately stop and refactor. You can't get it.
And there are limitations like that, at least in my experience, that in workflows there are straight limitations like that, where it's just, you cannot do this. You cannot reach out further than one level of a join, right? Sure. You can't go from the sales order to the sales rep to their supervisor or something like that. But those limitations are harder to find in scripts. So again, like I was saying, that space for where workflows fit just feels a lot smaller than scripts.
Yeah, no argument there. And I've always said that scripts are the nuclear option. That's what you do when you have no other choice. And you have no other choice, write a script. And the corollary to that is that if you can do a workflow, you should do a workflow. And I'm going to soften that a little bit. Obviously, there are cases where you could technically do a workflow, but why in the world would you? And our complicated transaction approval processes are certainly up there. If we can distill the logic between states into some sort of scripted field and then use a workflow to just transition from one person to the next, that's kind of a middle road that I wouldn't be opposed to. For instance, you might have conditions that make something approved for shipping, and then a script that checks a box when that happens, and then a workflow that just moves that from one state to the other, so different people can click the box and move it forward.
Sure.
That feels to me like a really good hybrid solution to keep the editable structure and the visible, transition workflow that you see in the workflow builder, the diagram, useful while still offloading all the heavy logic. I've done that before too. It turned out to be a really smart move.
The workflow action script is a great tool. I have found myself using that a lot for just the scenario I was talking about, where you have complex conditionals, or you need to go back to, you need to get collate data from a bunch of different record types, throw in a workflow action script, with some workflow fields or maybe some custom fields or whatever, check certain boxes, set certain values, and then let the workflow just read the outputs. I have definitely used that strategy a lot. But at a certain point, it's like, why do I even have this workflow here then? And to some extent, your documentation point where you've got this nice diagram, workflow diagram that people are used to seeing and following different states and transitions, that's great. But it's a nice picture, but it's very hard still to get at the logic, to like see it all in one picture. And to be fair, scripts don't have that either unless the developer documents them, which they should also be doing.
Oh, great.
I have to get some finger wags in. Being a coach.
All right, so let's look at some case studies and just try and get some opinions out there. What would you do? So add a button to create a custom record on a click. What would you do? Workflow or a script?
It depends on what the click is doing, but that is, for me, that's very easy to do in both. I would default to a script. And again, part of this is my experience, my familiarity, and the tool set, the tools that you have for writing code. So, we have IDEs where you can set up patterns and quick code snippets and things like that. So if I need to generate, and one very common request is adding a button that has a click handler. And so I can do that in a few keystrokes in my IDE, right? Because I have these templates set up to just spit out a user event script and the associated client script and put all the guts in there, the boilerplate basically in there for me. So I can do that even faster in a script than I can do it in the workflow. But that's not true for everyone, right? If you're just starting out and you're trying to decide which way to go, or you're kind of a novice in both areas, you have a much different story then.
Okay, that's fair. Personally, I would use a workflow for that. That's for me. That's
it's very easy to do, right? They give you a nice UI for it. There's an add button action.
There's an add button action. There's a transition on the button, and then there's an action to create a record. And then there in the UI, I can specify what the values of that new record are going to be.
Exactly.
And then I can write back that record's ID to the parent record that we clicked on, and we're done. And then you can transition even to the next record if you wanted to redirect the user's browser. For me, making the user event and then the client script and then the suitelet that I'm calling to create the record, and then deploying all that, and then having to pick up the phone later and say, hey, can you add this field as well or change this field? Knowing that I can say, okay, we need to update this field, go to this workflow action, change these things there and plug it in. There's no, where is the suitelet? Where is the user event? Where is this client script? What is this, where is all this defined? It's all right there in the workflow. That to me is a huge win. I would definitely do a workflow for that. Now, the minute they said, now I want you to populate the field on this custom record from a record 4 records away or completely related, then we're screwed. Then you have to do a script.
Then at the very least, you're throwing a workflow action script in there.
Exactly, but I think I would have to do that several times to make up for the time that I didn't spend writing the client script and the user event in that suitelet. For me, I don't have a canned template for that. Sure. That I can just whip out of my pocket, but I could do it either way, obviously, but I think in that case, I would be serving the client better doing it with a workflow. Now, there are clients and there are clients. There are those who would definitely get in there and break things. And there are those who would definitely not even get in there at all. They'd ask me to come make a change no matter what. But it's a whole lot easier to find somebody who can fix a workflow than it is to find somebody who can fix a script in that scenario with that level of complexity. So my answer for that one is workflow. Yours is script. Either way gets it done.
Sure, I think that's going to be the case on all of these, right? You
Yeah.
can probably do most of them either way.
Okay. Let's talk about the next use case. So we're going to
Okay.
email invoices on a schedule with a template. I tend to do that with a workflow. What's your feelings on that?
I have done that in both. And it is, again, pretty easy. I might actually do this one in a workflow, assuming, and like, there's always what ifs or like assumptions to be made, right? As stated, I might actually build a workflow for that, right? It's pretty easy to, with a send email action and setting up a schedule, right? That's very easy to do in a workflow. But it's just as easy to set up a scheduled script with a script parameter. And you can even make that script parameter a company, preference that admins can just as easily go update if they need to. So that one's like almost a tie for me.
Okay.
It
All
is
right.
very easy to do in a workflow.
Yeah, that's a tough call. I think I would probably do it in a workflow first, just because if
Mm-hmm.
my philosophy, of course, is script is nuclear. So if I can do it just as easily
Yeah.
either way, workflow wins for me because
Yeah.
there's no technical debt later on.
And I just,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I don't have that same mindset of scripts are nuclear, right? Scripts are default for me. And workflows are, I kind of cringe a little bit. I don't consider them nuclear, but I just don't have that same, approach to scripts or thinking about scripts.
Yeah, and maybe that bears some discussion too. Why do I think scripts are nuclear? Because I mean that my
Yeah, we
feeling.
haven't really, this does feel like we've been kind of, or at least I have been, anti-workflow, and we haven't really done the same anti-script side of this yet. So certainly we should throw that in here too.
Yeah, it's the basis of kind of why I feel there's that hierarchy. If you can do things with a safe search or a custom field or a formula field or something, do that. And if you can't, and you can do it with a workflow, do it with the workflow. And if you can't do it with a workflow, you should do it with a script.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I feel like scripts are last is first because they're more expensive. They're absolutely more expensive than a workflow. Unless you're hiring the guy who writes scripts at the same rate to write a workflow and maintain that workflow, and you're calling him every time you want to change an email address or change things around, then yeah, they're the same price. Because he's not as familiar with the workflow. He's going to spend just as much time on the workflow as he would on the script or more. But if you're talking about, I mean, most admins can create a simple one state workflow, set a field, pop up an alert, do something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's cheaper to maintain a workflow than it is a script. You've there's there's just a lot of technical debt in a script. You can write a bad script. You can also
Mm-hmm.
design a bad workflow, but it's a whole lot easier to understand what a bad workflow is doing because the UI tells you. Unless you read code and unless you read somebody's brand of code, we've all seen, some of the spaghetti out there. It's very difficult to untangle.
Yeah. I'm going to avoid the pricing and cheaper and more expensive things. You've known me for a long time. I have thoughts on pricing and things like that, but I will avoid those. That's a different soapbox. That's a whole different video for probably a different channel. Um, but I definitely agree with you. The just in the same way that the space that scripts can cover with their functionality is much larger, the space of support people that can help you with a workflow is much larger. So, and it can be very hard, especially if you don't have development knowledge yourself and you don't have developer knowledge in-house, right? You don't have any developers, even if they're on, not necessarily NetSuite developers. How do you know who to hire if you don't know anything about scripts? How do you know what you're going to get from a developer? It's much easier to figure that out if you have, because you probably have in-house kind of admin type of talent. So it's much easier to figure out who's going to be able to help you than it is with a script. You're kind of just guessing if you're hiring the first developer you've ever hired, right? You kind of just
Yeah.
have to take a leap of faith. And then how do you know what you got out of it? How do you know if this script was good if you can't read it? Obviously, if it works, it's fine. But did you get what you paid for?
That's easy to tell with a workflow, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that kind of makes me shy away from the script as a default is that scripts can do a lot more damage than workflows can do. Now, there are some, I'll be the first to say that a workflow will stop you from saving all transactions and put you out of business in
Mm-hmm.
some situations, but there's no delete record action on a workflow. It's a whole lot harder to be destructive with workflows because there are just a small number of actions that are supported. With scripts, you can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Workflows are much less powerful and therefore much less dangerous to put into the hands of
Yeah.
Of people who
A novice.
haven't been in NetSuite for years.
Yeah, it
So
is much harder to know enough to be dangerous with a workflow. That bar is much lower with a script because
absolutely,
they
yes.
they are much more powerful. I have no rebuttal. That's a very good point.
So and that's kind of why I just rank the solutions in that order and say, well, scripts if you've got nothing else, scripts if you have no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
Those three considerations: the cost and the maintainability and then the danger,
Mm-hmm.
are what brings me to that side of the tracks. And that's probably why you and I kind of agree on everything except for that gray area in between is where do we stop? Where do I go workflow versus script? And kind of like
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're talking about right here. And we both think that emailing an invoice on a schedule with a template at the outset at least should be a workflow. We both agree
Mm-hmm.
that that's the smart move.
Yeah.
Setting a field value based on another selection on a record, maybe at the time of entry or before submit. I think we
Mm-hmm.
can both agree that as long as your logic isn't relying on compiling data from all other records or
Yeah.
finding hard to reach conditions for that value, it's a workflow, right?
I would think so. Yeah. Yep. I've actually built that exact workflow very recently. Very simple. The only problem, not the only problem, but one thing that's annoying with this is it doesn't scale well in a workflow, in my opinion, at least. For every new kind of when that field is this value, this other field is this other value. All it is a map. This value goes to that value. This value is that value. And in a workflow, that gets, if you have a ton of mapping values, that state just gets,
Sure.
You get cross-eyed looking at all those set field value actions.
Oh yeah. So recently I ran into that myself. We started off with a very simple workflow that we wrote years ago that sets a date based on what time and what day of the week the order was placed. So if it was placed after 4 on a Friday, we want this date to be Monday. For obvious reasons, we're not working over the weekend.
Sure.
But this location is on the West Coast, and this other location is on the East Coast. So if
on
the
its
order
face,
comes
it sounds very simple, right?
if the order comes in on the East Coast, it's before this time and after this, and then what happens if you cross the date line? Now, if it's 11 p.m. on the East Coast or the West Coast, it's already midnight on the East Coast, and you've got a whole mess there. So at that point, in retrospect, it was a simple set field value. Oh, sure, no problem. Do a workflow out of it. And then we've invested so much time in refining the conditions of this workflow action that at the end of the day, we just threw up our hands and said, why didn't we just write a script for this?
Yeah.
And we kind of wrote ourselves into a corner and invested all this time and testing into making this work. And at the end of the day, we still needed a script to get it all right. So nobody can tell the future, So no
Right.
matter what solution you come up with, whether it's a script or a workflow, you may end up kicking yourself because there's, at least with the workflow, if you have the presence of mind to see when it's becoming too complex and to cut your losses, I think I think you can win. You start with a workflow because it is faster. I'm not going to say cheaper because we're sensitive about that word, but it is faster. It is faster, and then so your investment in that time is less if you have to scrap it
Mhm.
and then go with a script.
Yeah, given
Uh,
sufficient time, any system will burst at the seams like that, right? And so, and your decision making early on, at least mine, depends a lot on my position. If I'm actually building this, then I'm gonna gravitate towards a script almost always in almost every situation, except for very simple, you know, easy, straightforward workflows. And even then, I might write a script anyway. But if I'm not building it, if I, a lot of what I do is advise people, right? I advise clients. They have the talent in house. They just need advice on like how do we actually architect this. And you do a lot of that as well. So that changes the calculus a lot, and all kinds of other factors as well. Right? Who is that talent, and what is your budget, and all that good stuff. That's going to impact a lot of these decisions early on. But if you're just looking at functionality, any of these systems will burst at the seams. I just default to script because the seams are a lot further away generally.
yeah, yeah,
So you've
yeah.
got a little more room to scale generally, you know.
Yeah, it is harder to write a good script that has the good audit trail, good logging. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
that's another thing too. Is you do get some logging out of the box with workflows that you don't get with scripts.
And they
And
are nicely presented. They are attached to the records on which they occurred with
they're,
workflows.
they're not purged at random intervals like script
Mm-hmm.
script notes
They're
are.
not random. They're just
They're
difficult to nail
they're
down.
there's no way to know when they are. So
Mm-hmm.
nothing in the universe is random specifically, but
It's every 30 days, but when the start of that period was, you have no idea.
now, see, I understood that to be whenever the shared server reaches a certain cap of execution logs, the, the records are purged.
They might do
Um,
that as well, which makes it
so,
even tougher.
and that's what I found that sometimes even minutes
Well,
or hours after a script is run, I can't find the logs for them
but
anymore.
now you have, yeah, there's a different place now for the more permanent script logs, right? But still, the workflow, there's no question that the workflow logs are presented. They're easier to find, right? You don't have to know which workflow caused the error. You don't have to know, you just have to know there was a problem on this record.
Right.
And I can go see the system notes. I can go see the workflow execution logs right there on the record that has the problem. I don't have to hunt down a script. I don't have to hunt down a workflow. I don't have to do any of that stuff. There's no question that that's way better than the script experience. Especially like if I built the system and I know I got the email, I know which script it is, that's super easy. Then that's great. But that's like an ideal scenario. If I'm just coming into a brand new system that someone else built, I don't know what scripts are there. I have no idea what might be causing the error. I'm going to have to go hunt a lot.
Yeah, and that's, I think eventually they all get to that place, right? Because the same
Mhm.
developer doesn't work on this same account for his entire career, and admins come and go.
Mhm.
You're always going to be pulled into a, hey, this exists. I don't know exactly how it works. We think it
Yep.
works this way. Can you troubleshoot this for us? Why is this working? So, and troubleshooting is much easier, hands down, with a workflow than with
Mhm.
an equally complex script. Um, there's just a much lower bar to figuring out what's going on there, and much
Yep.
easier to fix it.
Yeah.
Copying
I
a
did.
workflow is also possible, and putting it in testing mode, and
Mhm.
doing things like that, where it's much harder to do that sort of a scenario with a script.
Yeah. It can. It definitely can be, and it's impossible on things like you say user events or something like that. It's easy to do on like a scheduled script or a MapReduce. Just add a new deployment, keep it in ad hoc or testing mode. But yeah, It's way easier with a workflow.
Yeah, agreed. So I think at the end of the day, I think we both feel that both solutions have their choice, and the gray area in the middle is
Yeah,
kind
they
of
do.
where we overlap. I tend to go a little further into that gray area with a workflow
You do, definitely.
than
Definitely.
you do, Eric. But
Uh-huh.
that could just be a measure of how much I've worked with workflows over the years, and maybe I'm just more comfortable with the interface. And
Sure.
um, I've we both hit horror stories on either side.
Both sides, definitely both sides.
Both sides. And
Um, yeah, I don't think, as is true with probably anything in NetSuite, right? There's no silver bullet, right? There's never going to be an always write a script to do this, always write a workflow to do that. That's, I mean, there's so many other factors. There's way too many other factors beyond just here's the feature that I need, that would make that determination, or at least adjust the thinking behind the determination. That, like for me, I have all these templates set up that just drastically cut down my development time. So my bar for writing a script, even if I did consider it the nuclear option, is still way lower because the investment I have to make to build out the infrastructure is so much lower, because I can just effectively click a button or type a few keystrokes and have all these files and deployments and SDF files and objects created and just go and just get to writing code. But
I think
that's
I suffer
rare.
from the same bias.
That's rare.
Well, I'm much more comfortable in code than I am in workflows. To be everything else aside, that's just where I live most days. So I suffer from that same sort of familiarity bias. That let's do it with a script. I know I can do it with a script. Can I do it with a workflow? Who knows? Who knows if that field's even available?
Yeah.
Right?
I suffer from confirmation bias in that regard, right? I've done it with a script, so why do I need to do it with a workflow? I don't even need to try it. It works with a script.
Yeah, and someone asked me, hey, can we do this with a workflow? My answer is usually maybe, because honestly, the support for various fields on any particular record is very spotty. Can I get at that field in the workflow? You'd think you can, but then you can't. It's just not there to pick from. And that's especially true with line fields too. Now that we've opened up sublist action groups.
Oh boy.
Those line fields are I mean, there are some fields that you can get at, custom fields you can get at, but a lot of the native fields you just can't.
Right.
So you think you're going to do it with a workflow and you can't.
Exactly. I ran into that same thing very, very recently. It's just, I thought for sure this would be a very simple workflow, and then you get all the way down, you've got all the states set up and all the transitions, and then you get to that one place where it's like, oh, the most important field is not accessible.
And then you're
so now I have to write a script to go get it and put it in a workflow field and read it from there. And it's still doable, but why did I have to do that?
Yeah. Why did you start on that path? Why did you just start with a script? So that's painful.
And it's hard to know that ahead of time, right? It's hard. There's no records browser for the workflow, right? There's nothing that tells you, hey, these fields are accessible by workflow and these are not. That's nowhere.
Yeah, you have to try it and then succeed or
That's the
fail,
only way to find out.
and then go cry into your beer. So if that's the only consideration, how easy is this for me? Am I sure I can do it? Then absolutely, I can do anything with a script. And can I do it with a workflow? Maybe I can. But if that's the only consideration, I'd always go script. But the other considerations are just, I don't want to be dealing with this script in 2 years. I want the admin to be able to handle it.
Sure.
Add this field, or add another email address or condition or what have you, and just give them the power to empower their customer to use their own instance. So that's the consideration that pushes me away from scripts, is that yes, it's easier for me, but thinking not of myself but of future me or future future clients. What's their life going to be like?
Have you actually had that happen a lot? Like, you've built a lot more workflows than I have. Have you actually been able to hand those off to your clients? Like, do they actually take them on and take ownership of them?
In some cases, yes, and they've done it. They've done it with an amazing alacrity.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I showed the workflow engine to one admin who'd never worked with it before, never seen it. I said, here's how you put a condition in here to just change a sales order from approved to pending approval when it comes in. And it was a fraud detection. And I turned around 2 weeks later, and the guy had like, he had built 8 different actions that all kind of did that, changed it on different conditions, and he did it in such a way that was really maintainable. He can just say, I want to disable this action for right now, and then leave this action in there, and each of these conditions would all do the same thing and turn it to pending approval. And they use that as a core process now through their fraud protection, their fraud prevention. It saved them doing, I mean, can you imagine contracting me to, or somebody like me to go in and say, hey, I want you to up our threshold for the dollar amount that a sales order needs to be. Okay, well, I'll write you a script parameter for that so you can change it yourself. Okay, and hey, I need you to change it so that if the build to address and the ship to address aren't the same, we can, but instead, I showed him the engine and gave him the first condition, and he just took with it. He just ran with it. In other cases, I'll still get phone calls that say, hey, can you update this workflow to change this thing?
Right.
And it's like, it's completely within your power to do that, but they're afraid to, right? They're scared to touch it. And that's just a personality thing. That
it is. It definitely is. It's a personality thing. It's a skill, level or knowledge level thing as well, comfort level. But the latter one has definitely been almost my entire experience. I don't think I've ever had a client take ownership of a workflow on their own, right? They just, and again, I haven't built that many, so my sample size is very small. But it's still, and like I said, I've built most of them recently, so I'm still getting, requests to change those. No matter, despite how many times I say, here's where you go to change this on your own, I still get the email, can you change this?
let me ask you this though. Where is that threshold between I'm afraid to touch a workflow and I'm afraid to touch a script deployment? Like, if you tell someone, change this deployment parameter, I think they're way more reluctant to do that than just, hey, go to the workflow and change this. I find that they're less afraid of that engine than they are of anything that says script in it.
Yeah. So first of all, the first thing I'm going to do where the line is, I don't know. Right. It's difficult to say. The line is where you can get your client comfortable, or the user, whoever it is. So the first thing I'm going to do, I totally agree with you. The gun shyness around the word script is very real. And so the first thing I'm going to do, if I am getting requests to change script parameters, I am going to move that to a company preference. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Then they can just go to, I'll just go to my, company preferences or whatever it is, wherever that's at. I forget off the top of my head. And they can go see it there. That's probably a place that the admin is much more familiar with and comfortable with, and they don't see the word script anywhere. And so that's the first thing I'm going to do. And again, my barrier to entry for scripts is so low, especially very common scripts, like we kind of talked about adding a button, but also, right, custom UIs with sweetlets are super common requests. And so I've got a templated framework set up that just generates a sweetlet with the functions I need to generate a UI and a client script and all that stuff. And then I can just get rid of all that boilerplate. And so that's so quick that the gap for me to build them an administrative UI versus like doing this in a workflow is so small that I'm just going to generate a new administrative UI for them and give them a new navigation. It just says, okay, when you need to configure this stuff, go to this menu and here's a few fields that you can tweak. If it's just one field, I'm probably not going to do that, but I'm just going to stick with the preference. But if they, need 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fields, then I'm just going to build them a quick admin UI, very simple, Sweetlet.
So that to me is insane. I wouldn't go that far to give somebody an admin UI to change what are essentially the parameters of a production
That's
script.
fine.
Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, or certain values, whether they're actually script parameters or not is kind of irrelevant. Just different values they need to change and tweak the behavior of a feature, right? You can do that in a workflow. You can do, just go to the set email action or send email action and change the email address,
Right.
or go to the set field value action and change the values, or go to this workflow field there, or here's all the workflow fields, go change those. But if, again, the bigger that workflow gets, the harder that stuff gets to find and retain and remember and all that stuff. And as soon as you change admins, that's all gone. Whereas if it's always, just go to setup and manage approvals or whatever it might be,
Sure.
that's still pretty quick and simple. And everything they need is in one spot. They're not clicking around. They just see all the fields they need right there in front of them. And so, again, most people don't probably, especially developers, probably don't have that templatized infrastructure set up, right? That I do. That's just, I've been around for 7 years. I've seen a lot of the same requests over and over and over, and I get really bored writing the same code over and over and over. So I don't. I templatize it and I, copy and paste it, basically. And with SDF, it makes it super easy to just generate some skeleton XML files and just change the values that you need to.
That's a good conversation for a next topic.
It is. You're welcome.
Whether to use templates and boilerplate or to write stuff from scratch every single time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually in the latter camp, but that's neither here nor there.
That's if it works and it's effective for you and your clients, there's nothing I can say about it.
I'm not gonna get into the discussion now. We'll talk about it at some other time, but I'm sure it'll be a fun discussion. Anything else you want to add in conclusion, Eric, as we wrap this up?
Just to reiterate, they both have their place, right? This is not there's never a silver bullet. There's not a one size fits all for any project or any client. And two clients who have the same project, you'll probably do different things, right? So I think the important thing is to be familiar with both and be aware of the limitations of both, the capabilities of both, and your comfort level with both, and use that to inform your decision. Don't get too settled on one way.
I think if there's anything that I could add, or just kind of distill this down, it's just to know the factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the pluses and the minuses of both approaches, and weigh those against each other. The script is probably safer from user destruction, I guess. Safer.
Sure. Yeah.
But it is
a little more insulated.
But it is much more volatile when you're looking at what it can do, what harm can come of it. A script is definitely it's got a higher limit of pain than a workflow does.
Yeah, and when you hit that pain, it is harder to find. If you don't already have a nice established relationship with somebody, it's hard to find people. It's hard to find people to help you, harder to find people to help you. And more importantly, it's harder to find good people. It's harder to know who's going to be good at helping you with a script.
All right, then, thanks. Thanks, Eric. It's great talking to you again. We'll talk to you next time, all right?
Okay, sounds great.
If you like what you see here, please subscribe for more content like this, and you might think about picking up my NetSuite Development and SuiteScript 2.0 ebook, which has plenty of code samples and some great tips. You should also subscribe to Eric Grubaugh's channel and think about looking him up for coaching services.